Welcome back, Coffee and Convo listeners. It has been a while, but it is your host, Liz Bullard, and this is my podcast where I talk about activism, politics, self-care with those that are boots on the ground doing the work, those that are passionate about this topic, and just those who are just really great at having good conversation. And I'm so excited to have Abby. She is a podcaster, and her podcast is Political Psych with Abby. And if you haven't checked out her YouTube channel, what are you doing? I mean, she is totally informational. It's so fun and witty, and I just cannot wait for y'all to get to know her some more today. So welcome, Abby.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, it's a YouTube channel. You're not the first person to call it a podcast. People keep doing that. I'm not sure why. But thank you so much. I'm so flattered and I'm so happy to be back.
Yay, fantastic. And so please tell folks, a little bit more about, Political Psych with Abby and your YouTube channel. What kind of stuff do you have going on over there?
Yeah, so my YouTube channel is about political psychology. That's the psychology of politics. Um, And basically, the goal is being able to give what useful information there is from science to people who can apply it in their lives and in their political actions,
Mm-hmm.
sort of democratizing the knowledge of the subject.
Mm-hmm.
But I also do a lot of videos that are just a bit more fun, like the one that I put out fairly recently as of this recording is about the political psychology of 1776, the musical. Um, but a lot of my videos are a bit more serious. I did one on the psychology of solidarity, and I did one on a moral foundations theory, which is a really interesting concept within political psychology and moral psychology. Um, I did one recently about some elements of the psychology of the abortion debate. And the one I'm working on right now is about climate anxiety and especially how that intersects with climate activism.
And I can't wait to chat with you about this because in preparing for the episode, I was seeing how it's becoming more of a concern for folks. It's driving folks to therapy. It's coming up more in conversations, even like for my own self, me and my friends are talking more about, how summer is different than it used to be, how, all these different disasters and things that are going on. It's just more present in our conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. It is on the rise, seemingly. It's hard to tell, though, because sort of the criteria for what constitutes climate anxiety is still a little bit variable depending on who's defining it. And also, I want
Hmm.
to emphasize that it's not typically like a clinical diagnosis,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's more of a feeling, and it can be like a difficult feeling to deal with. And I absolutely don't want to discourage anyone from seeking therapy for this or any other reason. And also, I'll put in a quick disclaimer here. I am trained in social psychology. I am not a therapist or mental health professional. So take that into consideration when listening to me on things. Um, and then, but having some level of distress about it is increasingly common and quite common, especially among young people. Um,
Really?
but having so much stress about it that you sort of can't function in your day to day life, that is still fairly uncommon.
Okay. So, okay, tell us a little bit more about, for context for people. So, when we're talking about climate anxiety, what does that, kind of make up? What are the components of that?
So there are a number of different definitions, but usually there's some component of worrying a lot about the climate, being stressed about what's going to happen in the future, what the future is going to be like. There can be elements about being stressed about your own impact and your own life,
Mm,
but also sort of the more existential issues. And then some people looking at the issue also include whether or not these worries are hampering your living of your life, like whether you're unable to focus on your work or your social life because you're so worried about climate change.
right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So It seems like there's a spectrum from just kind of,
Absolutely.
considering how your impact on the environment to it really kind of, again, like you mentioned, stopping you from interacting because you are so concerned with it.
Yeah, exactly. It's definitely something that's a spectrum. I think anxiety is a spectrum a lot of the time
Yeah.
because one thing that I've encountered a lot in the stuff I've been reading about climate anxiety is that anxiety in general isn't always a bad thing, right? Like it's
Right.
adaptive. There's a reason it exists evolutionarily, right?
Yep.
It motivates us to action. It dictates our responses to danger, all that kind of thing. But if someone has too much anxiety or an anxiety disorder, that's, when they have more anxiety than is appropriate for the situation, more anxiety than is helpful, and an amount of anxiety that is, hampering their ability to live their life the way they want to live their life. That's really where it starts to be like a really serious concern rather than just sort of part of the human experience.
Mhm. Mm, maybe it might sound like a silly question, but do you think that some activists have kind of used this kind of climate anxiety to fuel their work?
Oh, that's not a silly question at all. And there's actually a lot of literature on this. That's going to be a big focus of the video. There's a lot of indications that climate anxiety is higher among climate activists, but that the anxiety doesn't seem caused by the activism. In a lot of
Mm,
cases, it's sort of the other way around. Like being an activist can be anxiety producing, and I don't want to downplay that much, but there is a lot of indication that essentially a healthy and adaptive response to climate anxiety is activism, and that
yeah.
that does actually really help people, especially in like a community context,
Mhm.
um, because a lot of the time the worst experience of anxiety is feeling like you're alone in what you're
Right.
worrying about, like no one else is doing anything about the issue, and also feeling like you can't do anything. That is what tends to lead to really bad like despair and feeling like that's a lot of the time what makes climate anxiety worse is feeling like you can't do anything and feeling like you're alone in it. So,
Right.
climate anxiety is often prompting people towards climate action. And what's good is that there's indications that climate action sort of reduces a lot of the worst effects of climate anxiety because it gives you that sense of community. And also, this is really important, a sort of sense of hope and efficacy. And also, what was I going to say? Having that, it sort of goes both ways though, because having that sense of hope
Mhm.
um, prompts people to engage in more climate activism. There's one article I read which is really interesting about how um, basically having hope for the climate and having anxiety about the climate both prompt people towards activism. But if
Okay.
someone has both, that prompts them like even more strongly than those two would together. And there's fancy statistical terms for that, but I don't want to go into it.
No worries, but that's very interesting. And I liked how you talked about that community context because anxiety can feel isolating and it can just make you feel alone when you're just kind of like thinking, I can't do anything to change this. I think, um, we see all these different things happening and it's almost like it's happening to us. And it's like, what can I do? This thing is so big. So that's really hopeful in hearing that push, right? That push to activism actually is making people feel empowered and it is actually having change over time.
Yeah, definitely. And I also think that this is one of the reasons why it's important for activists, especially in the climate space, to talk about our victories,
Mhm.
right? The victories that there have been have not been enough, but they haven't been insignificant. And I think that there is a real risk to downplaying them because
Yes.
it makes people feel like they don't have any power and they can't make a difference. Um, but like I had this experience. I think it was a month or two after the Canadian wildfires were really, really
Yeah.
bad. And like there was terrible smoke in Chicago where I live, and I have asthma. So I felt it really, really badly. Um, and I was feeling sort of bad about climate stuff in general and environmental stuff in general. And I went to the aquarium in Boston, where I'm from.
Yeah.
And they were showing us the, little show with all the like adorable seals and stuff. Um, and as part of that show, they were talking about how Massachusetts Bay used to just be completely disgusting, right?
Really?
Yeah, yeah. But and a lot of the areas that seals were living in were really badly polluted, but there was shifts in legislation, right? That made
Mm-hmm.
it that protected a lot of those species, and a lot of those species are making a comeback now. And I really, really liked that messaging, especially because um there's a lot of the time, like, even I'm actually thinking of a different marine mammal show I went to at a different aquarium years ago, which was very much like, if you care about this, use reusable toothbrushes. And it's like, yeah, that's good too, but like, we do need the big systemic changes. And
Yeah.
it was really refreshing to hear them talk about, oh, here's this big systemic change that happened, and look at this massive difference it made, right?
Right.
And yeah, that's just in the context of marine mammal species, but it's a it's a really good indicator, right? um,
Absolutely.
yeah, and there are a lot of places, right, that used to have dirtier water and the water is cleaner now, or used to have worse air quality and the air quality is improved now, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and there's a lot more electric cars than there used to be, and that kind of thing, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's not enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's why hope independent of anxiety can be a problem, because it means that people don't feel the urgency of action, right? But I
Mm-hmm.
think it is really important to keep that hope up, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, and I like how you talked about like seeing the progress is important, highlighting those victories, because I think back to, we had the first Republican debate not too long ago, and
Oh
uh,
god, that was awful.
so you already know where I'm going. So they asked, like, raise
Yeah.
your hand if you think climate change is an issue. And the lack of accountability or acceptance can be very disheartening, seeing people
Oh
just
yeah.
discount how important climate change is. It's just like, you don't see this, you don't see these things happening, you don't see the impact to, whether it is our ocean life, our animals, or things like that. And so
Yeah.
I think it's so important to highlight the opposite, where people are saying, yeah, we do see this as an issue, and this is what we're doing, and this is the change, and there's so much more we could be doing, but this is what we can do, and this is where you can participate, and this is where you can mobilize and get activated. And so
Yeah.
I really think that I would love to know more, or know where to find out more about the changes that are happening.
Yeah, I would love that too. I haven't really found like where to find like a
Hmm.
concentration of positive climate news stories.
Hmm.
Um if anyone knows about that, I'd love to know, but like, that
Please.
is absolutely something that should exist. Uh
Hmm.
if anyone listening to this wants to start a website for that, that would be awesome.
Hmm.
um but and especially framing those stories in terms of, this is what's already happened that's good, here's how we can do more. And I think that there are some organizations that are already doing a pretty good job with that. Like, there's an organization here in Chicago I'm affiliated with called 350 Chicago, and we're currently working on getting the state pension fund divested from fossil fuels, but we've
Mm.
already gotten the city pension fund for Chicago divested from fossil fuels. So, like, a member of ours was speaking at a climate march yesterday, and she brought up, like, oh, yeah, so we've gotten the city divested from fossil fuels, and here's the cool, awesome impact of that. Now let's move on to the state. And I think that that's a really good way to be able to present things, right?
Hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. I was
Absolutely.
going to circle back to the Republican debate for a second, just something I
Please.
wanted to get off my chest. So, I I hate the way they talk about the south side of Chicago. Like, I live on the south side of Chicago. It's just like, it's so ridiculous. It's like, I'm like, there are issues here. It's not hell. Like, also, like, it's so clearly a racial dog whistle. Like,
Hmm.
um it's
1,000.
yeah, yeah. And like, um yeah, um it's like I'm a middle class white person who lives on the south side of Chicago, right? And I just know they're not talking about me, right?
Yes.
Um yeah. No, but It's nuts. I mean, it's nuts the way people in general talk about the South Side of Chicago. Um,
You know what? When I think about it, yeah, it's always like something bad or negative. But like, okay, tell us what is we're on this train of positivity. What is something that we should know that's a positive about the South Side of Chicago?
we've got beaches. They're awesome and they're
Really?
free and you can walk to them.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, we have beaches.
What?
So that's great in the summer. There's like a ton of festivals here and cultural things. The food's really good. The architecture is excellent. The
Come on,
University of
South Side.
Chicago's here. It's a world class institution. There are a lot of great museums associated with that and not associated with that. We've got the Museum of Science and Industry, which I think is the most visited science museum in the country. Like,
Really?
yeah, people are generally pretty nice. Public transit is not awesome. That's like an actual issue, but they're not talking about that in the Republican debate, are they? Or, and it's like the actual issues I see in my neighborhood are not the ones that they're addressing, right? Like they don't
Mm.
actually care about the people here, right? They just care about using this neighborhood and like this part of Chicago because it's not just one neighborhood, right? Like it's a huge fraction of the city, right?
Hmm.
Um, as like just as scare tactics for their base, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Kind of related, but when people get scared, right? Like, because again, like you see all this either, in the news, and when you have this fear, what can we do about that? Like, what can we do to shift to more mobilization and more activism instead of
Yeah.
feeling disempowered?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit different in the context of something like crime and fear of crime than it is in the difference of climate stuff. Although it's not actually totally separate. This is actually I was just at this climate march yesterday and this woman named Kina Collins, who I think is running for Congress, was giving a speech and she was talking about how she started off in violence prevention, but um in a lot of communities, because a lot of the communities that are really badly affected by environmental pollution and that kind of thing are also communities that have more crime and poverty. That,
Yes.
getting people clean water, getting them clean air is a good way to make those places essentially more hospitable to human life and therefore, reduce crime, reduce poverty in those
I didn't
areas.
think I didn't think about that connection. Not
Yeah.
at all. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't think it is one that people think about enough.
Mhm.
Yeah, but what I was going to say, I think it's important to give people a feeling that they have something to do and like a targeted thing to do, right?
Mhm.
Um, I think that that's really important on sort of both issues. I think it's a little bit different with something like crime because I think you also have to like figure out I don't know. Sorry, I don't have a great answer for this because I wasn't expecting to figure out how to tie these things together.
My
Um,
bad.
yeah, no, it's all good, but it's a good question. But I was going to say on climate stuff, it's very important to give people, a target of a thing they can do, and
Yeah.
especially a thing they can do together with their community. Um,
Hmm.
and also, unless it is somehow actually their fault, like as an individual, don't
Mhm.
make it their fault, right? Um,
Mhm.
like, you don't win a lot of people by telling them that, like, you go on 3 flights a year. This is the problem. This is not the problem. You know what I
Mhm.
mean?
Mhm.
Um,
Right.
yeah, you win people over by saying like, I mean, if you're talking about specifically emissions from air travel, you could be like, "Hey, are you interested in improving our interstate train network? Um, let's make it easier for you to go on vacation or to visit your family, not harder, right?"
Right.
Um, yeah, and also, I think one of the big things where it's sort of actually, I'm not sure how different it is because, well, sorry, I need to actually make the point and then I need to figure out the difference. But what I was going to say is, um, with climate stuff, there's this really interesting literature emerging about anger and the role anger plays.
Yeah.
Um, and that can be really, really mobilizing, right? Um, and uh, what was I going to say? So yeah, anger I think can be really important, right? And I think with environmental stuff, it's less common for anger to be directed in the wrong direction than it is with like crime,
Right.
right? Um, because with the environmental movement, okay, yeah, maybe some people are directing anger in some ways I wouldn't. But
Right.
like for the most part, they're mad at the right people, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're like, this oil company is horrible. This bank that's investing in the oil company is horrible. This politician who's not doing anything is
Yep.
horrible, right? And like that's a completely justifiable amount of anger and a good anger to have, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't even think it's unjustifiable to have like the this celebrity uses a private jet anger. I kind of think that no one should have a private jet. Um, um, but with an issue like crime, you risk people getting angry at the wrong targets, right?
Right.
Like I feel like a lot of the time with something like crime, people get really angry at like homeless people,
Right.
right? Um, who like a lot of the time either aren't criminals or are only committing petty crime out of complete desperation, right? Um, and it is this problem, right? Because a lot of the time, like when news or politicians or whatever talks about crime, they'll show B-roll of like homeless people, right?
Right. All the
Um,
time.
exactly, yeah, and that's a real issue. So I think that's a real difference between those two issues. I will say though that like in terms of mobilizing people on like anti-crime action, I'm way less acquainted with the literature, so I'm mostly going off like the theory I know about for other issues.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so take what I'm saying there with a grain of salt.
Absolutely. But it's getting my brain kind of tinkering,
Yeah,
especially um you talked about a thing that they can do in their environment together and thinking about creating change and thinking about
yeah,
this togetherness because again it sometimes it is isolating, kind of going back to the comment like oh we down dogging Southside Chicago or those that are homeless or whatever select group we want to just dump the problem on. There seems to be like this othering, but I like that framing the solution in more of an us thing. I think
yeah,
that could be really empowering. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. I think that the climate movement is almost entirely an us thing.
Yeah.
I think that the only them, right,
Mm-hmm.
are people who are actively promoting climate destruction by their actions in
Mm-hmm.
like a systematic way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So uh if you if you have the money to leave and work for an oil company, you are the them,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Um if you're a politician doing anything less than the absolute maximum on climate issues, you are the them, kind of, right? But the thing
Mhm.
is that there's always an option to join us, right? And you
Mm.
kind of already are, right? Because everybody's stuck on this planet together, right?
Yes.
um, and I'm not going to lie, right? If you're really rich, you are better protected from this than everyone else. But you're not
Mhm.
protected from it completely, right?
Right.
Um, you know, um
Listen, Oprah's, when they were having the wildfires, her orchards were almost, scorched. So, yeah.
yeah, but no, I think it is something where it's more of a collective issue, right?
Mm.
Um, and it's interesting also that not that many people have to lose for us to act on climate change. Um,
Mm. Tell us more about that.
well, like, so a lot of the stuff I've been doing is around like getting state pension funds and things divest and like operating budgets divested from fossil fuel companies, right? And what's really interesting is those investments aren't even probably good investments at this point, right? So
Okay.
like doing the more sustainable thing is not necessarily terrible for any government um uh or company's bottom line. although
Mm-hmm.
it might be in the short term. And we do unfortunately have an economic system right now that is like super focused on the short term.
Right.
Um, yeah, and of course, I mean, I have like more issues with the current economic system that don't relate directly into climate change. And um, there are a lot of people who make very good points about how certain climate action will require a greater overhaul of the economic system and all that kind of thing. But there is a lot that can happen that has yet to happen, that can happen without uh, completely changing everything, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Um,
and that's helpful because I think about like a place where I live where change is slow and you have a lot of folks who value um the old way of doing things. They think
mm,
that that's where it's economic and it's just the best thing. And so I like just talking about how these small changes or these changes can be more economical. And I think approaching some of these municipalities or even people in people's families that are like the old way is the right way. Well, this way is more economical because they understand green, they understand money, and so I think that could be a way to reach people.
yeah, no, I think it is sometimes a way to reach people. And there's some really interesting stuff about reaching different audiences with climate messaging. Like how you can target sort of different moral stances on the climate
Yeah.
if you're trying to reach conservatives rather than more left leaning people.
Mhm.
Um, positioning things like positioning environmental things as sort of a patriotic duty. Um,
Mm.
but that is, of course, something you have to be careful with because there is always the risk of eco fascism. But I do think
Um,
it is something that you can work with without getting to that point.
that makes sense. It, kind of on that same vein, that kind of to me sparks, what people could do kind of if they don't feel like they have that community yet, but just kind of like having that change in dialogue with people. What does activism look like in this climate anxiety space? What can people do to feel more in control?
Yeah. So the first thing I would suggest is trying really hard to find what community you can,
Mm,
especially locally and in person, because I just don't think we have the technology to really form those bonds digitally yet,
mhm.
or at least not completely digitally. So you can usually Google finding environmental groups in your area. If there aren't any, I hate to say this, but you probably should start one. Um, there are a lot of national or like statewide or even international organizations that if you want to start a local chapter will provide you with a certain amount of administrative support and training and that kind of thing, so you don't have to start completely from scratch.
Well, that's
uh,
comforting so people don't have to feel, like, alone in this. They could have some guidance.
exactly, yeah. One thing that I do find a little bit annoying about some national and international organizations, different ones are better and worse for this. Some of them, if you like sign up for their mailing list because you want to volunteer in your city, they do have this unfortunate tendency to just keep asking you for money instead,
Uh, yeah, yeah.
which is not awesome. So you may have to try a number of different groups. But for most people, they'll already be something local. So I urge people to get involved in something like that and try and bring some friends and some family with you. Um, but also, I mean, talking about things is good for your brain and it's also good for overall mobilization. So talk about this with the people you care about, right?
Mhm.
Don't start with the deniers. That's probably not good for anyone involved.
I think
Um,
that's really important, though, especially when you're starting with change. Sometimes we go to the hardest people, and then we get discouraged. So, absolutely, I think that's so important.
yeah, if you're not already sort of maximizing the usefulness and the involvement of the easy people, go for the easy people first. Um, get some
Mhm.
momentum going.
Mhm. Absolutely, totally.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, and I think that yeah, there is this that activism is essentially part of taking care of yourself with this climate stuff, right?
Tell us more about
Um,
that.
well, because it gives you that sense of community, that sense of efficacy, makes you feel like you're not alone in it. And it does, to some extent at least, improve um, one's mental health in likelihood. It's hard to do experiments on this exactly, but there do seem to be indications that it is good for your mental health to be involved in collective act collective action specifically on climate change. There's
Mm-hmm.
less evidence that individual action has the sort of same therapeutic effects. I'm not going to
Interesting.
discourage anyone from taking it, but it's not going to probably help your well-being as much.
That's interesting. And so, and I totally see that. And so, what I hear with that is like, if you are feeling a tad bit more anxious about this or passionate, and you're just like, I'm not doing enough, I'm composting, I'm recycling, really take that next step and see if you can find community. And that really might help that sense of unrest. Because it can be, again, isolating. We're not seeing the ocean get healthier overnight. This is a long-term thing. And so seeing others grow in their passion about, the environment can give you that sense of change, and that sense of like, like everyone's not out there, polluting and littering. So I think that is so
Exactly. Yeah.
valuable. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
And even just like specifically like events like protests
Yeah.
can give that sense of energy, right?
Really?
Yeah, no, there's some really interesting, so this isn't something that I've researched in a while. This is more like stuff I studied in undergrad. But I had this professor, oh God, why can't I remember his name? Oh God, this is embarrassing. Anyway, he did a bunch of really interesting oh God, why can I not remember? This is terrible. Um, he did a lot of really interesting work on sort of crowds and groups.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's a lot of sort of interesting stuff to suggest that yes, being in a crowd, being in a group is sort of like an altered state, but it's not like an altered state in the sort of bad, depriving you of your identity, depriving you of rationality type way that earlier researchers presented it. It's more that like those spaces where people come together tends to be sort of where that sense of collective identity and the sense of what goals are, how we're going to reach them, sort of momentum for movements is formed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, which is one of the reasons why I'm like a huge fan of you need to get people together in person at least
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, even if it's a group that mostly organizes online because of geography or resources or any of that kind of thing, like even just having a social event that can be really helpful because it builds trust and it builds connection in a way that really strengthens a movement.
Absolutely. Like, totally. Because I'm an online girl myself. I love online. And I had met some friends over the pandemic. And when we met in person, I think it just shifted the whole dynamic. Like, I feel like it really helped our group to just get more intimate and stronger, and just not fizzle out as a lot of people did, once, back to work and life kind of resumed. So
Yeah.
absolutely. So definitely making that, if your bond starts virtually, because again, like, you may be in a place that's a little bit more isolated in terms of this issue, but seeing if you can bring that in person somewhere, even if it's meeting one of the members, to really keep that synergy.
Yeah, exactly.
Lovely. Oh my goodness. So I'm feeling excited and inspired. You've given us some alternatives to throwing tomato soup on the portraits to activate climate change. If
Yeah,
you
although I'm not really entirely against that. I think they should make their messaging clearer, but I'm not really like, I don't know. I don't really want to condemn it, honestly.
Very fair, very fair. We'll leave that one on the list. But if you've told us a little bit, but if you had to, if someone's out there and they're just like, okay, I got my base level of, I do stuff that's good for the environment, but I want to do more. What is like one or two things that, that people can do outside of their house, whether it is with their neighbors on their street or within the city. Does anything come to mind as far as what's that next step if they're already on that first level?
Well, I think a lot of the time it depends on where you are. I'm a huge fan of local organizing and involvement in local politics.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I would really say, use Google, use community boards, use whatever you need, figure out what your local environmental group is, if there is one, and try and join it and then see what they need. Because they'll know what your local area needs a lot better than I will.
That's a good advice, right? Absolutely.
Yeah, and also the other one I was gonna say is, uh, like I said, unless you're like an oil exec, it's not your fault, and it's all right to be angry. It's maybe even good to be angry, and
Yeah.
it's also very good to be hopeful.
Mm,
And it's really about doing something with your emotions, because I think
I
that
love that.
a lot of the time people sort of treat emotions as if they're bad,
Yep.
right? And as if they're like not good in overall society and in political movements, but like they really are the galvanizing force for action, right? And I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's really important, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. And
I,
then I was also
mhm.
going to say that, like, if you are at the point where, like, you cannot do your day to day activities because of how anxious you are about the climate, like, please do seek help and support and that kind of thing. Like, finding a therapist is not a bad idea if you
Mhm.
have the resources to do that. If you don't have the resources to do that, try and talk to people who are not therapists, just people you care about it.
Mhm.
That's always a good idea. Um, Unfortunately, some therapists are not like the most climate aware,
Mhm.
but a lot are, and you can try and find one who is. That can be really helpful for a lot of people. So, like, general self care things are still worthy, right? It's
Mhm.
not just going out there and engaging in activism, but I think that that is a really good part of it. And I want to urge people to, like, not let their anxiety freeze them in place. I want them to be able to use that as something to galvanize them.
No, 1000%, and I appreciate that reminder. You know, I think sometimes we look to wanna change everything around us, but I appreciate that reminder to check in and say, like, remind yourself, like, this isn't your fault, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you don't do everything perfectly, if your house isn't 100% electric and you don't, you have that plastic, straw or whatever,
You live
like,
in a
it's
society, it's not your fault you live in a society.
right, you know what I mean? Like,
You
and
gotta
so
try and change the society. It's really more valuable to try and change the society than it is to try and change yourself.
yeah,
But
and
you can't do
so
that alone.
Absolutely, and again, like, sometimes it can feel, activism in general can feel sometimes isolating, and so just appreciating that reminder to be kind to yourself, making sure that you're okay, and that's gonna help you in this journey. That anger can be a fire if we're channeling it the right way, and so, again, thank you for that reminder of power of, what we can do physically, but also to do that internal work and making sure that we're okay.
Yeah, and also making sure that the other activists that you're working with are okay. Um,
Absolutely. No,
yeah, I think that
absolutely.
that's really important, right? Like, if you need to step down from something for your own well-being, please give the other people who will have to take that work up from you the maximum amount of notice, right?
Mhm.
So it's, you have to take care of yourself, but you also have to take care of the other people around you, and give each other the sense that you can rely on each other. I think is really important. So, like, I think
Yes.
it's this idea, right, that, like, climate change isn't your fault.
Mhm.
Um, it is your responsibility, but it's a responsibility you share with everyone else on Earth.
Oh, I love that. That's a really good place to pause.
Oh, thank
It's a
you.
yeah, it's a responsibility that we share with others. Absolutely. So listen, y'all, we're not alone. One day at a time, we'll get there. Thank you for the reminder that the oceans are getting cleaner. There is change
I'm
happening.
not sure if that's universally true, but it was for Boston Harbor.
I'm gonna take it. Listen, it's a win. It's a
It's a
win.
win, right?
Yeah, it's a win. And sometimes we don't see those wins when we look outside of our window. And so
Yeah.
I appreciate it. Abby, any last words? Where can people connect and find, you? Where should they go next?
Yeah, so my YouTube channel is Political Psych with Abby. If you type that into YouTube, you should get it. That's my main thing. I also have Instagram and Reddit, and if you want to support the channel, I have a Patreon, but you can get most everything. There's a little bit of bonus content, but you get most everything for free over on the YouTube channel.
Very cool. I didn't know you had a Patreon. So listen, y'all go subscribe, get the bonus content. Abby, again, this has been wonderful. Please come back anytime. Y'all
Thank you.
go and stream her content and make sure that you're being well and being safe out there. Bye.